In this video, we are going to learn to iterate through an entire 2D list. So in the last couple tutorials, you learned how to iterate through just the rows, and then you looked at iterating through just the columns. But now we're going to look at iterating through the whole list. Now, if you've not seen and understood and completed the nested for loop tutorial, I highly recommend you do that first, because nested for loops are kind of essential to understanding how to iterate through a 2D list. So let's get started. So here's our nested for loop. So we've got for I in range 4 and for j in range 4, we're just going to print out the values of I and j. Okay, now hopefully you've understood how nested for loops work. So I is going to start from 0, j is going to start from 0, and j will go up to 1, then 2, then 3, all while I stays 0. Because with for loops, this whole inner for loop has to complete before we go back up to repeat I. So I will stay 0, and then j is 0, 1, 2, 3. Now this inner bit has completed, so I is going to take on its next value, which will be 1. So when I becomes 1, we repeat everything within our for loop again. So j takes on the values 0, 1, 2, 3. And this repeats while I is 2, and then same thing while I is 3. And then both I is finished and j is finished each of those times. Okay, so this is how nested for loops work. And this is really relevant for 2D lists, because if you notice these numbers, I and j, these are the the indices of our 2D list. So 0, 0 correlates to this top column, this top cell, 0, 1 here, 0, 2, 0, 3, and so on. So you can see the yellow is top row, orange is the next row, and so on. Okay, so this is going to allow us to iterate through a 2D list. So I've just cut this list in half, but it's the same information, just that we've got a bit more space here. So this is how we iterate through 2D lists. We've got for I in range len grid, and that should look really familiar from the iterating through the rows. Okay, and then we've got for j in range len grid I, which should look quite familiar from iterating through columns, and then we're going to print grid ij. So notice it's very similar to our nested for loops, but we've got len grid instead of 4, and we've got len grid I instead of 4. Now, that's because we might not know how long our 2D list is, and it, just like earlier, it's just really good convention to do length of grid rather than hard coding it as 4. And then with this j, we don't know how long each row is going to be. And actually here, unless you know for certain that all your rows are the same length, you can't ever hard code this, because if rows change size, we need to know how long that row is, so it'll always be len grid I. And then, rather than just printing ij, we print grid ij, and that will be each individual item from our 2D list. So let's look at a couple more examples, and then we'll do some live. So here's our 2D list. Now notice each list from our 2D list is a different length, and this is on purpose. So if we want to print all items, we've got for I in range len nums, and that will be each row in our 2D list, and then for j in range len nums I, and that will give us each column in that row. And then we just print nums ij, and they'll print 4209516 3361. If we want to find the total of all numbers, very similar to before, but we will start from total equals 0, just like when we find running total algorithms. We've noticed lines 6 and 7 are the exact same as what we've had before, so len nums and then len nums I, and then we're just adding on nums ij to our total, and probably I should have printed that there on line 9. Let's just assume I went ahead and did that, and that will total up all the numbers in our 2D list. Now, the trick comes when we want to find an average, because when we found an average of, like when we were iterating through the rows or columns and we wanted to find an average, we knew how many items we'd done. But with a 2D list, you can't work out easily how many items are in it. So to find an average, we have to have another variable called count, and then every time we add an item onto our total, we're going to add 1 onto our count. Because if you just said len nums, well, that would be 3. And we don't have any quick way of working out how many individual items are in this 2D list. So we have this count that will count them all up for us, and then to find our average at the end, we can divide by count. Okay, those are just a few examples of iterating through a 2D list, and we will do a live example in a second. All right, we're going to do these 3 challenges. So first, let's start with outputting each item in the 2D list. So I've got my 2D list nums. Notice each row is a different length, so I'm going to have to use that. So I'm going to have for I in range len nums. So that len nums is going to be 4, 0, 1, 2, 3. So that's going to iterate through each row. And then I need a different variable j. So for j in range len nums I, because when I is 0, j is going to be 0, then 1, then 2. When I is 1, j is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So j will iterate through len nums I. And then we just want to print each item. So we're going to print nums I, j. Okay, and that'll just print each item for us. So you can see we've got 10, 20, 35, 30, 15, 40, 78, 10, 90, and so on, and then 15 is our last one. Okay, so that's how we output each item in the 2D list. Now, if we want to find the total of all items, I'm going to take this code, and I'm going to start with total is 0. And rather than printing out each nums ij, I'm just going to add that onto my total, just like that. So the for loop setup is the same. We're still using nums ij, but rather than printing, we're just going to add to our total and then print our total at the end. I mean, I have no idea what this is going to total to, but it looks like it's 406, which sounds about right. Cool. So that's the total of all items in the 2D list. And then we just clean this up a bit. We want the total of all multiples of 5 in the 2D list. So it's going to be similar to this total is the total one, but we need to add an if statement in. So if nums ij is divided by 5, if the remainder is 0, then I'm going to add that item onto my total. So all the code's the exact same. I'm just adding this if statement on. So remember, this is that if it's if it's even, this is if it is a multiple of 5. So if you divide it by 5 and the remainder is 0, you add it onto the total. I'm saying odd and even because if you were to divide it by 2, that would check if it was even. So that's a very common thing we do as well. But in this case, we just want multiples of 5. 290, that seems about right because there are quite a few multiples of 5 in here. Let's just change it for multiples of 7 to check if it's working. So it looks like 14 is our only multiple of 7. Correct me if I'm wrong. We've got 49 as well, which means we must have a 35 also. So there you go. You've got 35 and 14, both multiples of 7. So our total is 49.